9, so we're going to wait about a minute and a half, and then we'll get started this evening. All right, it is 5 o'clock, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Just a few notes. This meeting is being recorded as well as live streamed, so folks in the community have a chance to participate and listen in. We will also be using the raise hand feature this evening in order to eliminate some crosstalk. So please just use the raise hand feature whenever you have a question or comment. And then just on a note about the agenda for this meeting, I have been really looking forward to these meetings, especially these ones where we get to continue and get really in depth into the conversations that we're having. So much of what we do is we listen to a lot of the police perspective and the education around that, but where we really find the magic, I think, of what the PSAB is when we marry those two perspectives together. And so we get to do that this evening, talking about continuing the conversation, the dialogue around the body cam policy, as well as the use of force data analysis, and then going deeper into the conversation that I know was started at our last meeting around defensive tactics and qualified immunity. And on that note, I would also encourage everybody to participate. We'll be taking recommendations this meeting, talking about getting into the meat of things. I value just every perspective in this room. The whole planning team really does. And with that, John, if you would like to take it away. Oh, you are muted.
Thank you, Kim. Sorry I was late. Hopefully everyone had a good couple of weeks. It's good to be coming back with the board. I think the time is about 5:01, so we'll go ahead and start the meeting. Again, welcome everyone. I'd like to invite you to join me in the centering our conversations tonight. First, I'll read a statement, then I ask you to join me in a breathing exercise to help bring focus and thoughtfulness to the conversation today. Today, we convene to listen and learn from each other through reflection and discussion. As we reevaluate and improve our public safety practices, we elevate the voices and experience of the communities who we have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by inequitable systems. We thank you all who have advocated and worked on dismantling injustice in Tigard and our broader community. We build off of their effort to create more equitable and just outcome for people of all backgrounds and abilities. The purpose of our meeting is to develop the understanding of current public safety structure, practices, and procedure. Identify and eliminate institutional racism within Tigard public institutions by centering equity and racial justice. Bring forth concerns and experiences of our lives, ourselves, and our community. Bring recommendation to the city leadership to improve the lived experience of all people in Tigard. Now we do a breathing exercise together, and you may turn off your camera for this portion. Close your eyes and gaze softly downward. Feel the chair under your legs. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Feel your hand on your lap. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Feel your feet on the ground. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Slowly open your eyes and begin to breathe normally. Thank you for participating in creating space with me. I would like to call on Kim to do roll call for us.
Thank you, John. Commander McDonald.
Here.
Officer Nunn.
I'm here.
Shelby Rahala,
Here.
Michael O'Brien, I think I see you. Yep. Okay. Okay, you're here. So Abdi is at college. That board seat is reserved for the president of the Tigard High School Black Student Union. They just started classes last week. So as soon as they have a new president or designee, we'll fill that role. And Emilio Calderon.
Here.
Liz Newton.
Here.
John Trin.
Present.
Jimmy Brown won't be joining us this evening. Lee Landers.
Here.
Patty Lofgren.
I am here.
Justin Lowe.
Present.
Danny Rauda. Nope. Valerie Sasaki.
Present.
Sean Stoldreyer.
Present.
Nick Darmer will not be present this evening. And Jeff Mott.
Here.
Okay, John, that is roll.
Thank you, Kim. All right, I don't believe there was anyone who's going to speak tonight, but there was two written statement that was sent in. So
Yeah,
I think
John, do you mind if I clarify a little bit around public comment? I know there was some questions at the last meeting.
Sure, please.
Yes, so there was a question that came up. I know public comment was read at the last meeting, and then Sean had a question. So just to clarify what the kind of route is, especially because we have a comment this week that deserves a response. We generally don't read the comments that come in writing. However, it is the board's prerogative, like last meeting, as I believe Justin did, raising or elevating a comment that has particular relevance to the board's attention is always an option. When there are comments that require some sort of response, depending on what the feedback is, either staff will take a role in doing the response, or a member of the board will volunteer to do to create a response. Similar to when I think Michael Antonelli had before submitted a question to the board, and I think there was a couple board members who responded. We did get another question from Mr. Antonelli this time, or at least a request. He proposed adding a speaker that he had heard from recently. And I would propose that become a staff task item. We will go ahead and research the initiative that Mr. Antonelli mentioned, evaluate it, and determine where in our upcoming agendas it could make the most sense, and come back with a suggestion to the board. Is that acceptable? Or is there another proposal? All right. Yes, Valerie.
Oh. As part of that, can you please, Mr. Antonelli's comment was quite brief and seemed to focus on Washington County Corrections, which is sort of outside the scope of this board's mandate. So, you know, I support having the staff take a look into it, although I'm not sure how relevant it will be. So I would suggest that perhaps it's something that we could ask Eduardo to circulate, and then we can discuss whether it's appropriate for this group to move forward with it. Just some more background information on Mr. Simich's presentation.
Absolutely. Happy to do that research and
Great,
circulate
thank you,
it to the board. Sean?
I just want to comment. There wasn't enough information in this. I guess this is similar to what Valerie just said, but there wasn't enough information here. I wish I would have heard more to get some sort of a summary of what the topics would be. So maybe if someone wants to reach back out to them, clarify what
Right, that's what I was asking for.
Yeah, absolutely. We will reach back out, we will clarify, and we will circulate that with the board. Great. John, please.
Thank you. All right, so I don't believe there was anyone who called in to speak tonight. So tonight, no community member has joined to speak to us. So public comments are vital to the board's mission, and we welcome community feedback on our work. So if you have any comments for the board, written testimony must be submitted by 4:30 the day of the scheduled meeting. If you would like to speak at our meeting, please email our staff, eduardo@tigard-or.gov. That's UARDOR at tigard-or.gov. All right, I would like to move on to the next agenda item, which is the chief update. So welcome, Chief McPine. If you could give us an update.
Yeah, I'm going to do this in reverse. I apologize once again. Better connection when I take the camera off. What I'm happy to announce, if you recall, I think you all received some information on Washington County's mental health response team and how we were going to do a South Cities team. I am happy to announce that we have started that program last week. Officer Joe Northcote is been trained now, and then I will get to meet the clinician assigned to the South Cities starting tomorrow. And because, as you know, we're partnering with Tualatin and Sherwood for officers as part of that team. They're a little bit behind in getting their officers trained. And so we get the pleasure of having Officer Northcote and the new clinician work together in tandem for about 2 weeks together. So when we do a little bit more, since we're going to be meeting all the way till June of 2022, when it gets a little bit closer and we can actually give some real life examples and his experience, we'll get the clinician and Joe in there to the PSAB if you'd like, and have the opportunity to ask questions and have him tell you from his experience what he's learned. And the clinician will have an opportunity to share with you kind of her perspective, if that works for all of you. And then kind of hand in hand with that is lately we've received a lot of communication and frustration from businesses and community members regarding the increase in our unhoused individuals. And as you know, that's part of some of the national narrative and the police's role, or shouldn't be, in dealing with our houseless people and those experiencing some mental health challenges. And so as part of the leadership team, myself and Library Director Halstead Bernard take the lead, as this is one of the council's main goals. We're doing a lot of work regarding that, partnering with Washington County, trying to connect housing or temporary shelters with our individuals who choose to take those resources. And so there's just been a lot of conversations, a lot of trying to lead with, this is not a policing problem. This is much greater than that, but we have had an increase in our presence just because some of the behavior exhibited by some of our unhoused individuals. So again, down the road, if that's something that you would like to hear more about, we can certainly put that in the agenda, and that's my update for tonight.
Thank you, Chief. And Liz, please.
I just want to take a minute really quick and say, as usual, our police chief and police team have been really responsive. I know that these are complicated issues, and I just really appreciate your willingness and the willingness of the folks on your team to step up and try to work things out. You know, it's going to be a start and stop probably, but you're all very resilient, and I just appreciate, I know the council appreciates your responsiveness. So thanks. And we will see how all of this goes. I'm excited about the mental health crisis team getting launched. So thank you, Chief.
Sean, I see your hand.
Thank you. Chief, there was a report in the news about a body found, a 46-year-old male found in the Fano Creek area. I have avoided that area biking and walking. I used to frequent that area, but I choose other locations for a few different reasons, safety being my top concern. Is there any update available about what happened there?
Yeah, it's the ME has the lead investigation, so it appears to be natural causes. and they'll confirm that. The individual looks like he probably expired by the creek there. And so it's a little bit difficult to ascertain some of the details, but at this time, there is no indication of any foul play. And we're just waiting for the medical examiner's determination of the cause of death at this time. But there does not appear to be any connection, any safety issue with those who use the trail. It's not anything indicating that maybe even our unhoused individuals are in harm's way or unsafe either. So depending on the workload of the medical examiner, we'll get a little bit more information as we get that final report.
Okay, thank you, Chief.
Let's see, any other questions for the chief? Justin, please.
Not a question, but I would just like to reinforce what the chief had just offered in terms of potentially being able to discuss houselessness within our future meetings, especially when I think about the mission statement for this group being improving the lived experience of all people in Tigard. I think that also should and most absolutely include our unhoused community members. And so if there is space within our work schedule, I know that it is crammed and we have many other things to cover, but I think as this is one that also the community is invested in making sure that is supported and resourced in a very humane and compassionate manner, I think that it is incumbent on us to take that on as one of the topics we discuss.
Absolutely. I think we can find a place for discussing at least the police's involvement with the houseless community. Thank you, Justin. And Commander McDonald, I believe you're on deck next for talking about the updates to the body cam policy.
Yeah, sure. I know that Eduardo sent out the a draft version that incorporates many of the suggestions and recommendations from the board. And in addition to that, as we reviewed this, we continue to do what we've been doing, or we do with all of our policies, is reviewing best practices and also checking with what other agencies across the country are doing. So in that, you'll see some incorporation of the chief wanted something in there on like a preamble, a little bit more in there on that. We also added, which was something that the board had talked about as well, giving some better direction. So as you go through it, you'll see many of the things incorporated in there that the board recommended. And keep it in mind as we went through this, there's a couple of, well, not a couple of things. There's many things kind of at play in the background, not the least of which are some new laws that took effect or will take effect in the coming months that will have some implication to body-worn camera or actually all digital evidence. So there was a bill, Senate Bill 751, that was passed that talks, it's effectively about discovery, but it ends up having an impact on how we process our digital evidence so that it can be used for discovery. So that's something that is needing to be taken into account. That is taking effect January 1st. So that has an impact on, one of the suggestions that the board had was being able to make that video available quickly or almost immediately at someone's request. Well, we're very limited in how we can release that. And this Senate bill also has some nuanced language to that will that talks basically about the discovery process. So if a case is actually going through the court process, the police department doesn't have any say as to whether or not we can release that. So once a case is adjudicated, then we can do that. So oftentimes we are at the mercy of the prosecutors in terms of what we can and can't release for video. So that's an ongoing discussion. But to that end, the district attorney's office here in Washington County is in the process of convening a work group surrounding body-worn cameras, because most agencies in the county by the end of the year will have body cams. They're pretty much everybody's coming on board relatively quickly with their own programs. And then also through the Chiefs and Sheriffs Association, there is a work group that is in conjunction with the legislature. Senator Chris Gorsuch out of Troutdale is actually the legislative liaison for that, that's going to be working with the Chiefs and Sheriffs Association to work through the provisions of Senate Bill 668. So there's going to be additional legislation coming down the pipeline that's going to impact us in regards to how we can use the body cams, how we can release information, and things such as that. So we've incorporated as much as we can at this point into those or into the policy. And I imagine that most of you didn't get an opportunity yet to go through and review those updates, but please take the time to do that over the next couple weeks. If you have, the chief and I can answer some questions, but I did want to take a second, and the chief actually hasn't even seen this yet, so I apologize, chief. I had a sergeant that I gave a task to here recently, and my task to him was to do a spot audit of our compliance with body cam usage. So he went and figured out, once we had full implementation of our body cameras, meaning that everyone in patrol had been trained and they had been deployed, and he went out 2 and 3 weeks beyond when they had been deployed, beyond full deployment, because it took us a couple of weeks to get everybody with their body cams, get them all trained up and everything like that. So everybody had been wearing them for at least a couple of weeks. What he found, this was amazing to me, is that we were in compliance 99% of the time. So a couple of weeks beyond, actually overall department-wide, it was 96% of the time, but I'll get to that point. But 99% of the time, our patrol officers were activating their cameras appropriately. And we found a couple of areas where maybe they didn't activate them in time, or they left them on too long. So they didn't turn them on at the right time, didn't turn them off at the right time. Those are small training issues that we were actually very pleased to see 99% compliance. What he did find is that the sergeants were 79% compliant, and that glitch has been fixed. It was in his peer group. And he was basically, as he was doing this audit, he's like, "Hey, guys, what are we doing here?" So they've been much more attentive to that. And we'll do it again, probably 6 months down the line. Our 6 months after full implementation is when we'll do another check to see. And so just so that all of you are aware, that the general consensus from our officers is thank you. They are happy to be wearing them. They see it as a useful tool, and the amounts of digital evidence we have are unbelievable at this point. Actually, I think quite a bit more than what we had anticipated. But nonetheless, it's an excellent tool, and we're hearing thank yous from our team out there on the street. So just wanted to let all of you know that we had done that compliance check, just a basic low-level audit to see where we were at. And even just a few weeks after we had done full implementation, we're at 99% compliance. And I anticipate that it's still remaining in that area. I know the sergeants have brought their game up considerably, because Jeff actually did a spot check of the sergeants a couple weeks ago to see where they were at. So he'd given them another 30-ish days to kind of get their process down. And he said that the sergeants were figuring out how to use their cameras too. So anyway, any questions? I see the chief, you've got your hand up there, I guess, before we go to questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in, Jamie, when you were on these topics. First, on the body-worn camera group that's done by the whole chiefs, and so that'll be statewide, chiefs and sheriffs. I did share with them your recommendations for consideration is the two papers, one on the defense attorneys and the other by the ACLU. So I just said, I said the Public Safety Advisory Board had recommended us reviewing that. So rather than duplicate work, if they take a look at those documents in the work group, again, they may find some things out, recommendations there that can be put statewide versus just one department at a time. So kudos to all of you for that. And we submitted that forward. The other is, again, and I hope what the theme is that you were heard, that we took your recommendations serious. And that was, again, you thought that implementing the body-worn camera early on, that having sergeants just, they may check it or periodically, you all said that that wasn't enough. And while we didn't have the staffing, one was presented to us by having a sergeant light duty. And so we did found that to be an opportune time to have that sergeant work full time on this. And as Commander McDonald relayed, it was reaffirming to know that, because I agree, early on, you need that muscle memory and making sure. There was also some things we learned that they just didn't know how to kind of upload it and mark it as evidence. So there was training opportunities. And so again, appreciate the input that all of you had, and again, continue to move forward to only make us better. So go ahead, Jamie.
Actually, we have Valerie's hand up.
So I just want to, I did take a chance to scan it when Eduardo sent out the revised policy earlier today. And I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and incorporating a lot of the suggestions that we'd had into this policy. So I just wanted to make sure that I said thank you to you, Commander McDonald, and also to the chief, because I think that makes it's a better policy now. And I appreciate the chance to have this dialogue with you about this. And I also wanted to thank Jeff for all his heavy lifting on doing the research into, what is best practices in this area.
Thank you, Valerie. And Liz, please.
Yeah, just a couple of things really quick. I too appreciate the policy had a chance to look at it. And I'm glad to hear that the officers find it a useful tool, and hope that the policy helps clarify to our officers through the command staff what expectations are. And also wondering, Jamie, the comment you made about release of the data, the tapes to the public. I kind of really quickly looked back, and I don't remember the policy saying anything about where we sit when something's being adjudicated. I think it might be helpful for the public, if they're looking at this policy, to understand some of the limits that are placed on us, not in a defensive way, but so they're clear, why there's differences sometimes and why we can and can't release information. So just a quick little context might be helpful in those areas where you can think, okay, the public might wonder about this. And so I think it might be helpful to just add something that explains to them, how it works sometimes, because it's very reasonable, very understandable, but to members of the public, that might not be clear. So other than that, I appreciate all the hard work. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. And I know Commander McDonald was just taking notes, so we incorporated some. Any other comments around the body cam policy? And we can also make some time available at the next meeting if folks didn't have a chance to review it in the detail they would have liked. Okay, I see a thumbs up from Jeff, so we'll make some time next meeting as well. All right, wonderful. John, we'll move on to our next agenda item.
Thank you. So next agenda item is to discuss the use of force data analyst with Lieutenant Charleston. So you could take that away.
Thank you all. Let me get my screen set up here.
Neil, while you're setting up, let me do the lead in on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead, Chief.
Again, this was at a request that you guys had after you had a chance to look at our use of force data for 2020. I think, unfortunately, Jimmy's not here tonight. He was the one that really wanted to hear the behind the scenes stories and delve into it a little bit more. So that's what we've done. Luckily, these are recorded and he'll be able to catch up pretty easy. But again, a lot of work that went beyond this to look at the narratives, to kind of dig deep into making sense of the numbers and telling the backstory. So again, this was at your request for a little bit deeper dive. So go ahead, Neil.
Thank you, Chief. Can everyone see my screen there? Okay, great. So thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for having me. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Neil Charlton, Lieutenant in Inspections and Internal Affairs for the department. So basically what that means is I'm looking at data and accountability for a lot of that data and what that means. And it's a lot of data that I put into an annual report for the chief. Which I think you all have seen some of that, which brought up some of the questions that were had. So I took the questions from Commander McDonald and did my best to, I guess, put the data together so it means it's easy to read, I guess, somewhat. But some of it may need some explanation, but I'll just start with this. I looked at 2020 and 2021 for the use of force, or the actual phrase we use is force response data for the Tigard Police Department. And what I found was in those 2 years, we had 59 incidents of force response involving 59 people that were contacted by the police for different reasons. And I'll go into what some of those calls are later. There were 46 of those incidents in 2020 and 13 so far in 2021. So we're really down on force response. There are some still in the review process, but I anticipate for 2021 those numbers being somewhat lower from 2020. And that continues a trend over the last several years of a reduction in force response. As you can see in that at the top of that page there, it talks about those. There was a question about how many were self-initiated. And as you can see, only 6 in 2020 were self-initiated. And so far in 2021, I believe we have had no self-initiated incidents of force response. So basically, for those that may not know, they're either dispatched or the officer saw something that drew their attention and they self-initiated a call that resulted in contact with a person, in which brought about a force response based on the person's actions. If you look at I looked at the wrong note. So we have had 1 in 2021. So 1 out of 13. And then there was another question about outside agency responses. And we had 7 in 2020 and none in 2021. Now, one of the keys there that I looked at was in 2020, we brought our folks back from the transit police. So the majority of our outside agency responses where force response was used were actually a little bit more than half were at the transit police, tending to deal with people on trains and buses that began to react violently, or in like one particular incident, as we'll see later, attacked a bus driver. And so a little bit less than half of those in 2020 were outside agency assist from officers assigned in Tigard to assist agencies around Tigard, or on canine assistance calls. So as we look into the categories here, I wrote down 2020 and 2021, and as you could see on the right-hand column, a total for the both years. So the 59 total incidents. In the mental health section, BHI is behavioral health incident. There were 11 in 2020 and 2 in 2021 so far, and totaling 13. When we get into the section on race, as you could see, the numbers are 7 for Black or African Americans in 2020, and 2021 is only 2, for a total of 9 over that 2-year period. Hispanics 6 in 2020, and 2021 is 4, for a total of 10. Then as we move into impairment, and this is not something I had necessarily looked at specifically before, and no one had asked it, but it was part of the numbers I was looking through. So I went ahead and included it here. Out of the total 59 subjects that we contacted, 33 were either impaired with alcohol or drugs, or a combination of both in many of the incidents.
And Lieutenant Charlton, we have a question
Yes.
from Valerie.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And I am sad that Jim is not here. You know, the population, the African-American population in Tigard is about 1% of the population. And so I'm concerned when I look and I see out of 59 total force responses, 9 of them involved African-American individuals. Do you have any thoughts about why that number might be so outside of what you'd expect just based on sort of general population statistics?
Yes, I do have some data in looking at that, and a little bit of it will be anecdotal, but when I break down these numbers and did this deep dive over the last 2 weeks, what you will find is not necessarily all of those incidents occurred within Tigard. You will have at least 3 that occurred in the city of Portland related to transit issues, and then 2 occurred around Washington Square Mall, where we get folks traveling to the mall for different purposes. So not necessarily, and I didn't necessarily do a huge dive into whether someone lives in Tigard or not, but roughly about half of those numbers are going to be folks that do not live in Tigard, or as I mentioned with the transit ones, were not folks that lived in Tigard or weren't even contacted in Tigard. And on one particular incident that I can recall from my data was a person passing through Tigard involved in an altercation that drew a police response.
Okay. Well, I'm sure you'll cover more on this later, but you know, that was a focus of our conversation and our concern as we looked at this initially. So I'm sure other folks have questions about it too. So I'll mute myself.
Yeah, we've sparked quite the conversation. So actually, Neil, if you don't mind, I'm going to actually turn off your share screen so we can kind of all see each other a little bit better.
Okay.
And Michael, please.
Thank you. I just wondered, of the 59 incidents that you reported on, whether you were able to correlate any of those with traffic stops, and particularly with relation to the impairment category. For example, late night traffic stop involved that possibly resulted in a DUI investigation or that kind of thing.
I did look at that information, and let me pull up my notes here on that. And I didn't put a lot of these notes up where you all can see them, just because there's a lot of data here. And there were, if you look back up at the top, and just so I don't confuse folks, I'm going to talk a little bit about self-initiated traffic stops, and then there's going to be dispatch traffic stops, because we can actually get a call of a person who's driving potentially under the influence, and we dispatch an officer to that, which results in a traffic stop. So I don't want to confuse anyone when I'm talking about traffic stops, that there's more self-initiated incidents than what's reported here. So we had a total of 6 self-initiated incidents in 2020 and 1 in 2021 so far. But of those, of the total 59 incidents, we had a total of 8 traffic crimes that were reported. Now, traffic crimes can be DUI, which those 8, the majority are DUIs. And then there's hit and runs. And at least 3 of these were related to hit and run incidents where someone called in that their car had been hit, or one person who had actually almost been hit by a car. So you have majority DUIs and 3 hit and run. So those are traffic crimes that an officer was dispatched to, the majority of those, and attempted to stop a vehicle that was fleeing from either the hit and run or was stopped as a result of a suspicion of DUI based on observations. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. And Chief.
Yeah, just again, to put a little context into what we asked Neil to do, what I heard from all of you is why we're highlighting the difference between self-initiated or what we consider discretionary activities versus something that we're dispatched to, and we don't control what the circumstances are, who's involved, what the race might be. But certainly in some of the self-initiated, as you hear, again, national narrative of where are police doing traffic stops? Are they doing it in low-income housing neighborhoods? Are they targeting all of those things? So I wanted to really parse out the low number of self-initiated versus what we had that we were called to respond to. And again, these numbers may be low because this was in the COVID, we're still in a pandemic. So much of 2020, self-initiated activity was asked or ceased by me as a safety protocol. So our numbers are going to be fairly low while we're still in the pandemic.
And just to comment on what the chief's saying there as well, when you look at those numbers, I think we're usually somewhere in the 25,000 self-initiated calls in any given year. I believe in 2020, they were down around under 20,000. And when you look at that in context, 20,000 self-initiated contacts with 6 resulting in a forced response. That's a pretty low number. Sorry, go ahead.
And John, please.
A couple of clarification. I assume that 2021 is on a calendar year?
Correct, John.
And then the second question is in identifying race, is it self-identify or is it the officer identifying the race?
Let me think, because it would be based on this, it would be either identification. Normally it's going to be what's on their identification, because this is a person that is at one point in custody. So we're based off of if they have any state issued identification, or if not that, then it's going to be off the officer's observation. But the vast majority would be from state issued identification.
Thank you, Lieutenant.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, John. And Jeff, please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for sharing this data. I think it's super important. The numbers of use of force against Black people jumped out as well. And thank you for looking into a little more detail against that and kind of seeing what happened underneath the hood. I wonder, is there an official process monthly or quarterly to review this kind of information with an equity lens? Like kind of just what you did for this meeting. I think it'd be a good thing to implement if it's not too intensive.
Every force response is a very in-depth review is conducted. And just so I guess we have time, of course. So if it hasn't been explained before, when an officer at a scene uses force, as a matter of fact, any officer, and we're going to talk about these numbers a little bit on the next page, but because you can have more than one officer in one incident against one person use force, and they could use multiple options if the first one doesn't work. And what that means is, like, for example, if you're fighting with someone and you go to use your taser and that taser doesn't properly connect, you may have to go what's considered hands-on and end up in a physical altercation with this person that you're attempting to arrest, or and there's several categories we can talk about, but attempting to arrest, preventing them from escaping, or defending yourself or defending others are the kind of the categories that we look at. So every officer that uses force at a scene must fill out their own individual force data collection form. And what that is a fairly exhaustive form that covers everything from the identification of the subject, the reason for the contact, to what the person was doing prior to force being used, to what was the reason that the officer responded with force, to the different force measures that are used. And a use of force or a force response can be as simple as tackling someone that's running to prevent that's trying to get away. It can be pointing a firearm without discharging the firearm. It can be what's considered an armbar takedown. And when you grab somebody by the arm, this is a specific tactic that's taught, and taking them to the ground. It's a taser, it's a baton, it's any of those things, or even a canine bite that is specifically directed against a subject. So those are a lot. So they have to report each one of those. They also have to report if it was effective or not effective. And finally, they have to report whether which they're required by policy, whether they notified a supervisor, whether they called for medical attention, and whether that person was treated at the scene. They also have to report whether they were injured or the person was injured, what those injuries were. And so, like I said, it's pretty exhaustive. So that's just the beginning of the review process, because the supervisor responds to the scene of any force response. And then the supervisor begins a review of those forms and the full report, and reports that use of force up the chain of command for that exhaustive review so it goes to the sergeant, then it goes to the watch commander, then it goes to the division commander, all the way up to the chief of police for a final review by her. Then it's forwarded to professional standards and internal affairs. And so we have kind of a dual role. We look at it from the perspective of, were policies followed, were policies violated, where is there any training aspect, because the officers could still do everything right, and we could gain something from that for a training perspective. So professional standards is going to review that and make suggestions, which we probably about 4 this year we've looked at and found small little tidbits that we could pull out and say, okay, let's have our training leads take a look at this for consideration in training. And then it comes into internal affairs or inspections. And then I conduct a review and I enter it into a database for tracking. And so that's the exhaustive review. All along the way, there is a consideration about who force was used against. Sometimes, especially with problematic issues within Tigard, whether it be someone with mental health issues or a repeat offender, which we do have an incident, not necessarily someone of color, but we do have an incident where we have continuous contact with the same person. And every time we do, when they've committed a crime, they want to fight the police. And so you also look at that and you try to gain ideas of how can we better approach this person in the future and attempt to reduce our chances of a force response in contact with that person. And so I say all of that to say, at the end of the year, I conduct that report for the chief, both an internal report and then there's an external report that is conducted or reported out, and we talk about we look at the race of subjects, the mental health status of subjects that force response was used against. And we look for any type of patterns or considerations for why those things occurred. So I try to analyze that, get input from it, and report that out to the chief at the end of the year. So, and that's a review of all of the force responses for the year and pulling that data back to the present and looking at it and saying, is there a pattern that we can look at? And like I said, the last couple of years of data that I've looked at is that we find that, and I expect we're going to see less and less of this as this year goes on, with the numbers being as low as they are, that while we do have a low number of folks that are Black or African-American living in Tigard, the incidents where we have, like you see here, 7 for 2020 and 2 for 2021, half of the ones in 2020, roughly half, are folks that we contacted outside of Tigard or were coming into Tigard or transiting through when they were contacted by the police.
Cool, thank you.
So if I can just piggyback on it, just to add on Neil, Jeff, to answer your question more specifically, yes, on the equity lens, Lieutenant Charlton is being, he has set up a nice matrix. So doing this by hand, I've seen his work. He's got spreadsheets now. And so this kind of deep dive with the equity lens, yes, that has now been incorporated, and he's done a fantastic job of that.
Cool. And that's kind of what I was looking for in the answer, was the time taken to take a step back after you've done all this exhaustive review with all the inputs and information for each specific use of force, but taking the step back and looking for trends. So it sounds like you're doing that. And is that in the annual report? Is that what would be available to the public? Yeah. Jamie's nodding. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Justin, please.
Hi there, Lieutenant Charlton. Thank you very much for providing that really important context into our questions that we've had around use of force, and in particular, the disproportionate numbers that exist for our African American and Black folks. This doesn't necessarily require a response from anyone from Tigard PD, but more so and piggybacking off of Jeff and Valerie's comments, and especially considering the concept of an equity lens going forward, I'd like to go back to one of the comments and discussions we had quite a few months back when there was an increase in Asian Pacific American violence across the entire nation. And I remember making a comment at the end of one of the meetings stating that I have many family and friends who reported, for better or for worse, that they did not feel safe in other parts of Oregon, but that they were coming out to Tigard and to the surrounding areas. They're coming out to visit Washington Square. They're coming out to visit H Mart and all the other amenities and businesses that we have that are wonderful here in the city of Tigard. And with that meant that there's, for that moment in time, an increase in the amount of AAPI folks who were coming through Tigard. And that percentage, I'm sure at one point, was greater than the actual percentage that resides in Tigard and is the population of Tigard. And so when taking into consideration the context that has been given with the use of force with Black folks and African American folks who might have either been passing through and not residents of Tigard, or were visiting the mall or the shopping district, I hope that we can also take into consideration that even though that may be so and they're not residents of Tigard, that is still an opportunity for us to hold ourselves to a higher standard of practices, as well as to ensure that we are doing our best to treat folks who are passing through and visiting with dignity as guests of the city of Tigard. And also in this same sentence, I would also like to again extend appreciation to City Councilor Liz Newton for pushing forward that that resolution denouncing anti-AAPI hate back earlier this year. Thank you.
Thank you for your observation, Justin. And Sean, please.
Thank you, Lieutenant Charlton, for sharing this information. Very helpful. Have you kept track of any data, or can you share? Do you know the kinds of percentages of use of force by action? And what I mean by that is, what percentage of how many people passing through a residence were being picked up that had a warrant out for their arrest that escalated into them trying to get away? Or were these traffic stops that escalated over a dispute and got out of hand, or was it a crime, and was it self-defense or a crime against another individual? Is there any kind of data about the causes of these things you could share?
And Lieutenant, that might be a really good segue into the remainder of your presentation.
I think so. Thank you, Kim. Yeah, Sean, I think that some of that will be answered as we go into the next page. And if you don't get your answer, I do have some detailed, I've had to scrub a lot of, identification and things like that, so I don't give out folks' personal information, but I do have some details related to that, and I will explain on the next page kind of how I broke everything up and as we went into it, so that you can ask questions related to those specific things. Do I need to share it again, Kim?
Yes, yes.
So I think it's up there. So just to wrap up on that final page, if you look at the bottom of it, the age range, I did break it down there. I don't know that anyone asked a specific question about this, but as you can see, the vast majority of folks that there was a force response used against were in the age range of 21 to 29, and then on up to 30 and 31. So there were 3 incidents of juveniles where force was used, and I want to draw a distinction here as we go into some of the other numbers. We do not, or the use of a hobble or the use of a wrap, both of those things are to prevent someone from causing further damage or attempting to injure themselves or others, and they're usually placed on someone. Actually, they're normally always placed on someone when they're already in custody or they're attempting to fight custody. In other words, they're in handcuffs being transported or they're about to be placed into a police car. And that is not considered a force response or use of force, but we track it anyway on the chance that during the application of the hobble or the wrap, someone is injured, whether that be the person being contacted or the officer, that we can track that information as well. And so in the particular event of the 3 juveniles, at least one of those was in putting a hobble on because they were attempting to kick out the window of a police car. So are there any questions about the age ranges? If not, I'd like to go ahead and move forward to the second page.
No hands.
All right. And so as I understood some of the other questions, and I think what we're getting into here with some of what Sean was asking, the questions were what types of force were used, what was the cause of the force used, and then the necessity for the type of force response. And what I've done is to show you each category that we track. And these are only incidents where one of these was used at some point other than baton in the last 2 years. As you can see for the baton, that's the expandable police baton, that has not been used in 2 years. And I think it even goes back, if I recall, 3 years, we have not used that in any force response. So a control hold, very low number for both 2020 and none for 2021. But a control hold is normally something that would be you're escorting someone from a crime scene who is possibly a suspect in the crime. And then basically you're just, they don't want to leave, so you're escorting them away with your hands on them. And in that control hold, something that's normally taught and trained, there's a response from the person where they end up injured. And that's where we would consider a control hold a use of force. If it doesn't result in injury, which could be just an abrasion or something more serious, taking someone, like I said, from the scene or possibly in handcuffs and they begin to fight and you have to use a control hold and they get injured, we do track that as a use of force. So very low usage. And as you can see, based on those very low numbers in 2 years, only 50% effective. The most common used is the takedown. There are multiple styles of takedowns. It ranges from basically a tackle. One instance being that I'm thinking of, an officer is at a scene taking a report from someone who had been hit in the head with a stick in a domestic fight. The suspect had fled. Other officers were looking for that person. The officer's talking to the victim and another witness when this person runs out of the dark, rushing the officer, trying to tackle the officer. The officer just turned and bear hugged this person and took him to the ground. The person had been armed with a machete, but they dropped it somewhere in the dark. So that's a very common instance where you just grab a hold of someone and tackle them to the ground, or it can be what I talked about, the arm bar takedown. It can be what's called a leg sweep, where you just sweep the legs and use the motion of the person who is fighting you to put them to the ground. Or even it could be something as serious as a hair takedown, where you're pulling them to the ground by their hair. And that, we haven't had any of those in the last 2 years that I'm aware of, but that is usually a result of something when you're in a really serious fight for your own safety with a suspect. The hobble wrap, the wrap is, sorry, go ahead.
1 second, we have Jeff has his hand raised.
Thanks, Kim. So I think you were saying earlier that multiple uses of force could be in one interaction. And so, but am I right in saying that, like, for example, if a control hold in 2020 was not effective, you also might count the takedown as effective? Is that correct?
Very good point, Jeff. Yes, that's exactly, or Sean, that's exactly right. When you have something that's not effective, most times, and I haven't done the actual percentages on this, most times a second option is used, which results in the effectiveness. So 59 incidents in the last 2 years, as you can see, 2020 alone had a total of 112. That means that 112 force response were used in those 46 incidents in 2020. So, and that could be from, someone that has a knife, I pointed my firearm at them, ordered them to the ground, and that didn't work. That's a use of force, reportable. And so you count that, but it's not effective because they didn't do what you told them to do. And then you move on to something else. If they drop the knife and rush you, do you take them down with a takedown, or you use physical strikes, which is the next category below hobbles and wraps? Did that answer the question?
Yeah, it did. And I guess it's just hard to see. So I can see the 112 uses of force, but not that 46. Was that on the first page? But that's what I was trying to get at.
Right.
Sorry.
46 incidents in 2020 and 13 in 2021 for a total of 59.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Commander, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, Jeff, it would be completely reasonable to think that if I was an officer and I was placed in a force response situation, that I may end up using a couple of different types and they could both be considered effective. So I could use a takedown, which was effective in taking someone to the ground, but now they continue to be combative, and I could use physical strikes while I'm on the ground, and those could also be effective. So it is totally conceivable. In fact, I can tell you that a number of those, that's exactly what happened, where somebody was taken to the ground and they continued to fight and resist, and the officer then resulted to an alternative force, which may be strikes or something like that, and those would also be considered effective.
Thank you for the clarification. John, please.
I'm just curious in terms of just looking at the previous page race and looking at in terms of the different tactic, the force of use. Has there been a overlay in terms of what's use of force occur for what type of race?
I do have that information, and I can look through it, but I did not break it down by race as far as what was. I mean, the data's there, but I did not specifically look at anyone who is Black or identifies as Black, what specific force response was used against them. I don't have that. Well, I'm sorry, I do have that. I just would have to pull that from the data. And if we wanted to wait toward the end of the presentation, I could probably look at a few instances of that. I think more likely than not, when you're looking at the numbers here, when you're looking at takedowns or physical strikes, you're probably looking at, or pointing the firearm, which is the next closest number, you're probably looking at a safe bet that those would be more prevalent. I would have to look back at specific numbers related to the incidents. As I was going through some of the data earlier, I didn't really see any specific, like, here's a type of incident and, any particular race breakdown was responsible for that type of incident. I didn't see any pattern along those lines. But the data is in there. I could look at that.
Thank you, Lieutenant. And I think you were on the hobble wrap line.
Thank you. And so moving on down, you see physical strikes or physical blows as another, or the second most common. And what that looks at is, and it could be anything from a trained strike, a palm heel strike, or to a slap. It could be a response to, for instance, I know in one particular incident, the officer is talking to the suspect and the suspect suddenly rushes at the officer attempting to hit them. So the officer responds by striking the subject's arm. That's a use of force, or that's a force response in an attempt to either defend himself or herself, or to take the suspect into custody. They're striking that person either to stop them from hitting them or to redirect them in order to get control of them. Matter of fact, there's several instances in here where a suspect is either not present at the scene or is close by to the officer, and the officer's talking to them, and suddenly that person moves to attack the officer, which resulted in, I believe, 3 cases of assault of the officer, or charges of assault of a public safety officer. Moving on, as you can see, baton not used, as I said earlier. Pepper spray is something that we see infrequent use of with the advent of the taser and the heavy training that we have received around that. The taser has kind of taken, the pepper spray has kind of taken a backseat as far as usage, but it still can be very effective, especially if the taser has not worked. Some folks just either the probes don't make a effective about it. It's a small number, but then the OC spray, pepper spray, tends to be more effective. As you can see, 4 of 1 and 4 effective in 2020 and 1 in 2021. Low usage but high effective rate. And then and you can see the numbers for taser. I know I think we've had 1 more tasering, which brings the number to 4 for effective for 2021. So those numbers are trending a little bit more effective, but that one's still under review. And as you can see, what's considered the less lethal beanbag round, not used very often at all, and none in 2021. As far as that I've actually seen yet. So the pointing a firearm can be, like I said, these are typically when someone is armed or the situation is unsure. It could be in a high risk situation, such as the stop of a stolen vehicle, or as I mentioned earlier, the subject's armed with a knife and you're pointing the gun at them and giving them direction. You can see that it's effective. The numbers for 2021 just are not solid enough yet to rely upon, but you could see in 2020 that it was effective a high percentage of time. And then the canine bite, there was I think a question about canine calls. I believe we had a total of 4 canine assistance calls that resulted in force in 2021 and 2020 and 2021, but only 2 resulted in a bite. So that means that the officer ended up using force with the subject, either after the search and finding of this person. So it wasn't a situation where the dog would bite. Those are very rare. And I know in these particular incidents of the dog bites were against people who, one had it was a domestic where the man had assaulted someone, and the other was a violent felon who was known to carry firearms. And a risk assessment with the arrest team was that they needed to arrest this person as quickly as possible to prevent them from getting to their firearms. So that person ended up getting a dog bite after the track. So very low occurrence there.
We have a question or comment from Valerie.
Hi. One of the things that I'm a little bit confused about this chart is that, so we talk about pointing the firearms, but were there any discharge incidents where the firearms were just discharged?
There were none in the data that I looked at. There is the one that's currently under review and before the grand jury. I don't have, as the internal affairs inspections lieutenant, I don't have any access to that data yet, so I can't report it or put it into the database yet. So that's the only one, and I can tell you for an absolute fact that there are no others. Okay. If we discharge a firearm, it's going to be at training, and it's under a controlled circumstance. But in the line of duty, prior to 2021, I think we go all the way back to 20, and I'm just pulling this off the top of my head, I think 2016 or 2017.
Wow. Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Commander.
Yeah, the only other exception to that would be as if we ended up having like an injured animal that needed to be dispatched. That does not fall under a use of force. It's in our policy. It's one of the exceptions. So approved training, dispatching an animal, things like that. So,
but any discharge of a firearm, even dispatching an animal, has its own review to determine whether it was reasonable or not.
Yep.
Okay, moving on to, I'm just going to check our last page here, and this gets into the reason behind the force, and it splits it between the actions of the person that force response was used on, and the reasons the officer decided to use the force response. And I again broke these into the 2 years. So the categories that you see on the far left for subject, for the person being contacted, these are the categories that the officers are selecting from when they're filling out that form I told you about earlier, and that the force response review is looking at those to consider whether they are reasonable to have force used against that person. Then when you look at the next I guess column over, reason for force response by officer, those 4 categories below that are overcoming resistance and make arrest are in the same category, and then you have the 3 others. And we have another, or I should say an other category on that form, but it is rarely, if ever, used. These are the 4 reasons that most officers are going to mark that they used force to overcome resistance or arrest this person: defending self, defending others, preventing escape. I would say that the majority of the time, and I think I covered this down here, if you look down below. Oh, I was going to talk about de-escalation. I'll come back to that in a minute. But in these numbers, the majority of the time, the officer is using force against this person for multiple reasons, not just attempting to make an arrest. So what you're looking at normally is the process is that making the arrest is the last action that the officer takes before or attempts to take while attempting to arrest this person. They could be using force to defend others or defend themselves, like I talked about the person attempting to tackle the officer. So they defend themselves, and then that person continues to fight, and they use force to as well to make the arrest. Or in one particular instance where the person rushed the officer, the officer used a defensive blow to stop them from hitting them, and then the person tried to run away, and so they tackled them. So there you have two uses of force, one to defend themselves and the other to make an arrest. In the case of someone who attempts to is attempting to harm someone at the scene, like there was a fight in a hotel parking lot, officer arrives on the scene, is waiting for cover, but then he sees these four people fighting, and he sees one who's the particular aggressor. So he runs forward shouting for compliance to stop fighting. The person ignores him and runs and kicks a person laying on the ground that they had already knocked to the ground. So in that instance, he is defending others, and then the person that he's attempting to arrest begins to run away or attempt to escape. So he uses force not only to defend others, but to prevent escape and make the arrest. Looking back at the subject actions priority force response, these are very important. There should never be on our form a category where any of these are not selected if force was used, because we don't use force on passive resisting people. You can escort someone from the scene, but we don't use force on passively resisting people. So they need to be doing something that broadly or attempting to assault a citizen, actually be armed, while they can be passive if they're armed with a firearm or a knife or something like that. That would lead to a force response, such as pointing the firearm at them and giving them commands. And there are a couple of those that we have that I looked at in this last 2 years. And the other category is reported or perceived to be armed. We actually have that happen quite often. Is someone calls in and says, there's a person doing this and I think they have a machete, or I think they have a knife, or I think they have a gun. There was one particular instance where a person had a water gun, and it's, you know, a Nerf style water gun, I guess. But the officers were able to ascertain that very quickly. It did not save the victim from being, and quote unquote, pistol whipped with that toy gun and causing injury, but this person wasn't able to cause further injury with an actual firearm. But that one was marked as perceived armed. I'm sorry, not perceived, reported as armed, because originally to dispatch, they were told that this person was armed with a firearm. So, and then finally, engaged in fighting, and that can be engaged with someone at the scene fighting, engaged in fighting with the officers upon arrival. The vast majority of all the force response that I looked at, and I think I do have those numbers here. The vast majority were all at some point engaged in fighting. If that wasn't with other people at the scene, it was with people just prior, or it was with the officers, or in some cases, while the officers are on scene, they start fighting with someone else, and that's when the officers respond. And then if you look threatening to fight or physically resist, we have this, especially, these were not numbers I had specifically looked at, but if you look at those totals, 28 in 2020 and 13 in 2021, those numbers show that when the officer arrived, this person was either actively threatening to fight someone else, threatening to fight the officer, or getting ready to physically resist, and the officer's attempting to communicate and overcome that resistance usually with voice communications to begin with. But then after that, they either engaged in fighting or attempted to run away, and the force response was used. Any questions about these categories? Okay.
No hands.
Okay. And the other thing, and this is the first year that I'm taking a look specifically at this, is de-escalation. There are 4 elements of de-escalation: time, distance, cover, and communication. And so we're actually, I'm looking at adding that to our force data collection, because while the information is already there, I have to dig for it. So adding it to our force data collection is going to be a lot. Actually, it's only for me. It makes it easier for me to pull that data out and then report it to the chief. But it also would help us in solidifying the message behind de-escalation and helping our officers recognize, look at what you're already doing and recognize it as de-escalation, and cement that as a concept and an ability to recognize that as they go along. Surprising numbers to me when I looked at it. I found that 1 or more of these elements in 44 encounters that resulted in force response, the officers used 1 or more. So that's 44 out of 59. And then the numbers just continue from there. So in 6 incidents, officers used all 4 elements of de-escalation at one point in the encounter. That means they attempted to communicate, and they attempted to maintain their distance. They attempted to maintain cover, and they attempted to wait for more officers in order to have that presence and use that time to their advantage. Now, the question could come up that, okay, well, if you used every aspect of de-escalation, why did you still use force? And, there are going to be those times that you just cannot get someone to comply. For example, the officer that I talked about arriving at a hotel parking lot fight, that officer had intended to wait for other officers to arrive. They didn't know the circumstances going on about this brawl in the parking lot. So they were attempting to use time. They were attempting to use their cover. And they, when they see what's going on and they see a person on the ground getting kicked in the head, that kind of, escalated the situation where they had to respond in order to protect that person. So, and there are many instances of that throughout this data. And that's where you could run into a point where, yeah, we used every element that we could. But, I guess it's, you're overcome by events, you're overcome by circumstances. Now, when we go back to it, I do look at least 2 events that I found where no elements of de-escalation were used. And that's another one where you kind of come up to a point where you're overcome by events. And that's, for example, I think I talked about the officer arriving on call with the machete, domestic violence incident. Someone's already been, cracked in the head with a stick. The officer arrives, knows that someone's supposedly armed in the area, but sees the victim and sees a witness, and moves to find out if there's going to be a need for medical assistance for the victim. As they're standing there, someone shouts. The officer sees this person coming out of the dark toward them, and that's him. So this is an instance where no element of de-escalation was identified in the reports that I reviewed. So I can't find anything there. So that's going to be a time when no element was used, but the officer has no time to respond and does the best they can and tackles the individual. But an assessment immediately that the person's not armed with a machete anymore, and responds with a physical tackle rather than pointing their firearm or using some other something else that's going to possibly result in physical injury. It's a lot of information. Any questions about that?
Yes, Valerie.
Sorry, I had to find my unmute. So this has been super helpful, and there's a lot of information here for us to digest. So I think we're gonna have to sit with it for a while. One thing that I would find really helpful that you touched on earlier is going back and looking at the different categories of use of force events on I think it's page 2 of your document, to see how they break down by racial categories, because really that's what we've been charged with, is, you know, helping evaluate, you know, the impact of this sort of thing on BIPOC communities within our community. And so I think it would be helpful, to the extent that there's, you know, differential perception or communication that maybe, you know, can help bridge that gap, to see how these things break down. So, you know, I suspect that we're not going to finish our discussion of use of force today. But I think that would be a useful jumping off point for us next time, if you have the time between now and the fourth Monday of the month, to take a look at that information.
Well, I can actually go one up there and say that while we've been sitting here, I've tried to multitask throughout my last little bit. So if I seem like I was droning on, I was also looking at the data. So in regards to the Black population that in this information that had force used against them, the majority were either takedown or strikes. We had one incident where a firearm was pointed at a Black individual, a young Black male. This was after a crash where folks at the scene got involved in an altercation. And when the officers arrived, this individual turned to them and had a firearm in his waistband. They communicated. This is one of those where I think actually I can look at that real quick. Yeah, so distance, communication, and time were used, and officers obviously used cover and talked the individual into surrendering, which he was cooperative and did not touch the firearm. Obviously, they detained him and removed the firearm, and that was the desired result. So a use of force, pointing the firearm at them, but it was actually the result that we wanted. There were no one's injured. And so that's the one instance of pointing a firearm, but the majority, so we're looking at 9, I believe it's 5 out of the 9 were takedowns. 4 were strikes. 1 was a hobble. So again, not necessarily a use of force, but we report it in our data because we track that. So, and then the rest of them was 1 use of a taser, which was effective. And that covers the totals for Black or African American. And so the question, sorry,
I have 5 out of 9 were takedowns or strikes. And then one was a hobble and 1 was a taser. So I'm still missing 2.
No, I think it was 5 takedowns. And let me look at the strikes.
Okay, I misunderstood. I'm sorry.
That's all right. So 1 strike, no, sorry, not strike. 1 taser, 1 pointing the firearm, and
okay,
I believe the remainder were strikes.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Lieutenant. And Sean, please.
I share the concerns about the high percentage of Black Americans that, you know, had to use of force. I also think that institutional racism in the U.S. has a lot deeper root causes that start much earlier in someone's life than a police encounter. But my question on this, since I don't have anything to add to that line of questions, in terms of statistics, I'm comparing this use of force in 2020 to 35,151 police contacts. So that comes to 0.1%. And police contacts, I assume that's not chatting at the farmer's market, right? That's like a citizen calls for police help or there's a traffic stop.
Correct.
Okay. And my other part is, can you share how many people are successful? Like say someone's driving through from Portland or whatever, they have a warrant out for something. And they're concerned, you know, I'm not throwing out this potential scenario, but they want to go home to their life, not go to jail. So they make the decision to try to flee, either on foot or by car or bicycle or whatever. Is there any statistics you can share about how often people are successful in eluding the police? Because it seems to me that in that situation, there's either going to be use of force or there's going to be the person will successfully elude.
And I think the commander might have something to add as well.
Neil, I'll pop in.
All right.
You know, Sean, we don't keep a specific set of data on people that flee from us because people run from us all the time that we don't chase. In fact, we probably have more people run from us that we don't chase than people that run from us that we do. And there's a specific reason. And part of it is we may not know why they're running from us. So we try not to make it a practice of chasing people when they're running from us for no apparent reason, especially if it's in a vehicle, because that's very dangerous. So foot pursuits are actually incredibly dangerous for officers too. I mean, we see officers get injured all the time on foot pursuits, and not from fighting with people all the time. It could be twisting an ankle, chasing somebody too, for that matter. But yeah, we don't keep a specific statistic. Now, it would be part of the data set if we did chase somebody and force was used as a result of that. But simply chasing someone on foot isn't going to trigger anything specifically here. A vehicle pursuit would. It's a separate review process that we do.
I also track those, yes.
Yeah, and Neil tracks those for the agency as well. So vehicle pursuits would get that. We would have a report of a foot pursuit, but we wouldn't specifically have. We don't pull that out as a separate data set. And quite frankly, it doesn't happen all that often.
They're very dangerous.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's useful. I mean, it kind of goes to show, and it might not be in these numbers. You know, an element of de-escalation always is, you know, choosing to walk away. And if we're doing that as a community or, you know, our law enforcement arm, so be it. That's still de-escalation. Both people go away safely.
Yeah, and that was one of the things we talked about when we were talking about, you know, the behavioral health incidents that we have. We walk away from those on a regular basis. When we've determined that a person isn't a threat to the community, we'll walk away from those. It's in the best interest of the community, and oftentimes in the best interest of that individual to walk away and then have them addressed maybe in a different way by a professional clinician or doctor at a later time. But we often walk away from incidents like that. So yeah, we do. We walk away. That is one of our options in the vast majority of things that we have. A mandatory arrest is a different story, but oftentimes we have the opportunity to walk away from things, and we do. So
thank you.
Thank you. Liz, please.
Yeah, I was going to follow up quickly on what Valerie raised in terms of the data, and I wonder if it might be helpful, Lieutenant, in your review, your year-end review, to see if there's a difference between. Now this is getting real matrixy, which everybody's going to be surprised at me suggesting, but the difference, if there's any correlation between race and age and type of force used. The reason I bring that up is I think there's a perception, particularly on the part of our, I'll be frank, young Black males, that they're treated a little differently. And it might be good if you see patterns in terms of your training. I'm not saying you will, but it might be valuable as you're training folks to be mindful of that. So just following up on Valerie's comment that might be an interesting data point if it's not too hard to come up with, to look at age, response, and race. So that would be my suggestion. But very good report, very thorough, and I just can't believe all the data that's available that would be helpful for our community to take a look at. Thanks.
And yeah, to that question, Liz, I did actually take a look at some of that. As I said earlier, I was looking for trends in a lot of, or sometimes just trends want to kind of look at, so you go and double check to see what you have. As far as age goes with people from the Black community, I only found 3 under 30 from those 9. The rest were spread out throughout the age group, with I think the oldest being around 52.
And I guess the point I'm getting at is, if our people in different in that age group, for example, approached similarly in a similar situation to, other people of other races, non-Black. Because I think the reason I'm bringing that up is I think there's a perception in communities that for the same kind of infraction, they may be treated a little differently. And, I'm not saying that's the case, but I think I'll look at that to see it, even to be used as training with folks on your team, in the department, our officers, and for the community to know that that's something that we're mindful of. I just think that might be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. And I believe, Valerie, do you have something to add to that line?
I do, and it goes to one thing that I'm going to do after this meeting is I have some resolutions that I've prepared as a discussion points for our next meeting. And one of the things that I do wonder is whether it would be administratively practical to increase the frequency of when this data is aggregated. Because, I think we're at a point right now where we're having a lot of these really important discussions, and it might be more useful to be able to look at data on a quarterly basis, maybe with the year-end summary of where everything stands. But to have that be available on a quarterly basis, so that as we're talking about implementing change and addressing some of these issues, or perceived issues, because data can exonerate as often as it can condemn, right? That data be available. And I think that would go to the goal that I hear from the council, which is transparency, and transparency and communicating with the community about, I recently heard someone adding the word justice to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which gives us a lovely acronym of JEDI. So our JEDI goals for this community, I think quarterly data might be better. So I'm going to circulate that, but just I wonder whether that is administratively practical from your perspective.
I would say, we look at that data already as far as reporting it out. One of the, I guess, impracticalities of it would be that with the amount of incidents that we have, we could have maybe one related to someone who's Black or African American in the first quarter, and then none for the second or third quarter. As you could see for 2021, we have a total of 2. Now that number could stay there or it could go up, but reporting that out in the first quarter, you may not have any no effective data on that, right? And then what does that look like if within the first quarter you have contact with 5 people and one of them is Black or African American in a force response situation, and that indicates that 20% of the people that we contacted were Black or African American where force response was used. So it can be done. It's just looking at what that tells us exactly. Sure. And is it in any way effective?
Sure, but I think that would go to what Liz was saying, is that I think there's this perception out there within some of our communities that data really could go to help address. So anyhow, I've taken up enough of everybody's time, but I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you for the recommendation, Valerie. And Commander, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things that Neil didn't mention is that we actually evaluate each of these as they come through on an individual basis. And we also, we're doing a couple of things. We're checking for patterns. We're also checking for to see if it's maybe an individual officer that's using force more often than another. So that's our responsibility, or actually I should say ours, Neil's responsibility. Neil's in my division. So it's Neil's responsibility to evaluate those things as the inspections lieutenant, and then bring those concerns to myself and the chief if there are any. So that's one way that's continually going. And then one of the things that we do more regularly is we look at data sets over a period of years rather than those shorter time periods, because smaller data sets can really skew data. As you can see by the 2021 data, that's a very small data set. So it's, going back to, it's been a while since I took statistics, but going back to those days and you look at that, the smaller data sets are, they're less reliable, I guess. So we try to use those over a period of years. And Neil alluded to the fact that we've watched our actual total numbers decrease in recent years. So anyway, just as a kind of as an aside, we're constantly reviewing that and checking to make sure that there aren't any patterns or areas of concern that might be a red flag for us.
I would like to say I would look forward to the day in my career when my data is completely unreliable because it, gets closer to zero for the year.
Thank you very much. Lee, thank you for your patience.
No problem. I just had a couple questions. How many people do you approach that have CWPs? And if you do, how do they react to you? Do they do like I do? How every time I get in contact with an officer, I pull out my card, I show them, and I let them know where my firearm is. Do you have that many situations like that? And would the level of force be a little different than what we were, have been talking about on if you came up on somebody who had a CWP but was acting a little spicy, so to speak?
And can we clarify what the acronym CWP stands for?
Concealed Weapons Permit.
Thank you.
All right. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I can largely only speak to this anecdotally over my career. And for the most part, I've only ever contacted people with a concealed weapons permit who were extremely cooperative. On those incidents that I know of where someone's contacted who is some type of, who is challenging the Second Amendment in some way, or challenging the police with the Second Amendment and openly carrying a firearm, those can tend to be a little bit more contentious, but every one that I've ever seen was de-escalated to the point of they didn't leave necessarily happy, but no one was injured. Outside of that, the majority of the times that we confront someone who is openly displaying a firearm, another crime has already been committed, whether that be one that I can think of from memory as an armed robbery spree with a pursuit where the suspect is openly firing at officers throughout the several miles of that pursuit. That person at the end of the pursuit continues to point the firearm and it results in an officer involved shooting. That is one of those situations where that person's going to be challenged by having a firearm pointed at them, but that's definitely not in any way relatable to a concealed weapons carrier who has a permit. So I can't think of any time where I've contacted a concealed weapons permit holder who was aggressive, confrontational, or in any way that I'm aware of ended up having a firearm discharged at them as a result of displaying that firearm or having a concealed weapons permit. Does that answer your question, Lee?
It sure does. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you, Lee. And John, please.
Yes, but thank you, Lieutenant, for the presentation. It's very interesting data to look at. Just for my context, do you have data to really talk about in terms of all the context that you have breaking down by race? This way we could look at from the get a baseline of here's all the context, here's all the context with the use of force, with the overlay of the race, that kind of stuff. So, for example, how many contacts do you have with African American or Black people, right? Because you have data regarding the use of force. This is the number encounter. How many encounter have you overall have?
Yeah. And I think the commander might want to tag in for this one a little bit too.
Yeah, Neil, let me handle that one.
Yep.
So largely, John, so we keep track of it for self-initiated activity when it comes to traffic stops or like a pedestrian stop through the statewide stops data collection. So we do keep track of it to a degree. So those are the self-initiated ones. So and that's where the legislature decided is most important to them and to the community is the self-initiated work by law enforcement to be able to evaluate that, because the calls for service that we get in are coming from other community members and we're responding to whatever that call for service is. So we do have the number of self-initiated activities that we would have with different communities of color. Yes. So we have that information, and Neil would have to verify, but that's, boy, gosh, it's going to be a really low number in those particular instances that are going to be across all of the, across the entire data set that would result in uses of force. Because as you can see, the vast majority of our uses of force are involved with calls for service and not self-initiated activity by officers. So we could probably identify that. I hate to put words into Neil's mouth, but it's probably something that wouldn't be incredibly difficult to do. Although the length of data that we have for that isn't incredibly long, just because we haven't been, we don't have a long-term, it's only a couple of years worth of data that we would have.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. And Sean, please.
I'm a person that believes an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. I believe the more we invest today in education, nutrition, the more we'll save later in prison costs and healthcare costs. And in that line of thinking, I wonder what could we do as a community? I don't know how we control people outside of a community passing through, but what could we do in our community to reduce use of force by reducing the number of calls for service? I mean, statistically, if we cut the calls for service in half, that would potentially cut the use of force in half. And I just wonder, what are the things we could do as a community to accomplish that? That's probably a larger question that we can answer right now, I suppose.
Thank you for the food for thought, Sean. Jeff, please.
Yeah, fully agree with what you just said, Sean. My comment was more to John's question, and maybe Commander or Lieutenant can answer too, but isn't the stop data annual report, is that a good place to look for stop information by race and age? It's on the, I see a couple of head nods, right? It's on the Tigard Police website, but it looks like the latest one is up to June 2020, and it's a yearly thing. So I guess, one, is that a good place to look for that kind of information? And two, is there a June 2020 to July 2021 report coming out soon?
Yep, it should be available really soon, Jeff. And so, yes, that's a good place for it. As soon as we get it, we'll throw it up on the website again, because that's really the best spot for it. So yeah, as soon as we have it, we'll send it out there.
Thank you. I don't see any further hands. Are there any more questions for the lieutenant on the use of force data that he shared? No, it was a wonderful discussion, and we are quite nearly at time. I see some applause emoticons showing up. Thank you very much, Lieutenant, for joining us this evening. So because we are at 11 minutes before
Thank
the
you
end
all
of,
for having me, and great question.
because we are 11 minutes from the end of time, and we definitely need to spend more than 11 minutes continuing the conversation around defensive tactics and qualified immunity, I propose that we do a brief chat about current events and how they are impacting Tigard before we move into next steps. And I see John nodding. So John, take it away.
I was going to open up the floor to see if anyone has current events and how they impact the Tigard. So thank you for that, Kim.
And Lee, please.
There's just been ever since over here at the it's called the Ridgeable Mountain now, but not the colonies anymore. But anyway, there's just been a certain amount of stuff that's been going on, and I really want to thank the Tigard Police for we've been noticing them driving by and coming through here a lot more often. And that's really just a visual deterrence, is making people think about what they're going to do, because there's cars up on the top are getting broke into, cars getting stolen from our parking lots, just random people walking through here and everything else. And it has slowed down since there's been a more presence of Tigard officers that come through. So just it seems like it's getting a little worse. I don't know what made it change. It's getting better, but at the same time, there's more and more people that are coming around here that I've never seen before, and I've been here for 4 years. So yeah, that's just kind of what I wanted to share. I mean, they're about to renovate this building and do all that good stuff. So things are looking on the up and up for that part of it, but we just kind of need to take care of the innards and make sure people are acting right over here for us hardworking people that deserve a respectful, place to live. That's about it.
I'm sorry you're going through that, Lee. Thank you for sharing. And Valerie, please.
So I just think it's worth mentioning that this Wednesday starts National Hispanic Heritage Month, which is where we recognize the contributions of our Hispanic communities. And I believe that the Hispanic population is our largest minority population in Tigard. And so I wanted to mention this with the hopes that it would raise awareness for the contributions of the Hispanic community.
Thank you, Valerie. All right, I see no further hands. John?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Valerie, for mentioning that. Kim, can you let us know what the next steps are?
Yes. So at our next meeting, we will reopen the conversation around the body cam policy, as everyone will have a chance to have reviewed it between now and then. We will, as the staff, look into homelessness and policing and where maybe that can fit into our schedule, as well as review Mr. Antonelli's recommendation and circulate the information that we discover with the board. In addition, we will also have our continued conversation around defensive tactics and qualified immunity move to next meeting. All right, I think I hit everything. Sean, would you like a last comment?
Thanks. I wanted to add on to what Lee said and support what Lee said. I had an opportunity to deliver food with Packed with Pride a number of Saturdays. I couldn't do it as much as I wanted to with my kids and family, but we have a large number of multi-family housing facilities in Tigard, very large number that, I'm in the construction development business, and a lot of these, they are in need of maintenance. I don't know if it's unfunded maintenance or it's a choice, but generally speaking, these units need maintenance. They lack green space. They can get crowded at times. I don't know. I think that's just generally speaking. I think that's a concern for Tigard. Something we should work on. If you go to the city doesn't publish. I don't think the city publishes crime statistics by neighborhood anymore, but I think what Lee is saying about what he sees in his area, I mean, I think that can, if you look at where crimes are occurring in Tigard, I mean, I think that kind of follows that trend, and it seems to be around, areas that need parks, areas that need better maintenance, safer living conditions. So I don't know how it's all connected, but it's just what I observed in my time here volunteering in Tigard.
Thank you. Thank you for your observation. And with that, John.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your participation tonight. I think the board is important, and I think we have a purpose here, and there's a value to our experience, our voices, and so thank you for that. Thank you for the giving us the next step, Kim. For now, I'd like to ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Valerie. Anyone want a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Patty. Hearing no further discussion or opposition, I call the meeting adjourned. Thank you all.
Have a good week.
Everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye. Later.